Between the Covers, the show for readers and writers and lovers of books. I'm Stephanie, and I'm a publisher at Red Penguin Books, where we publish books of all types and genres. So if you have a book in your head, files on your computer, or maybe even 300 sheets of loose leaf shoved in a drawer, please visit redpenguinbooks.com and unleash your inner author. I'm so excited that we have three authors who have absolutely unleashed themselves today. Mark Torres is the author of Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood. Mark is also a fiction author. This is a foray into nonfiction that there's a part of me wishes it were fiction, but we'll get to meet Mark and hear all about that. Vincent Casale, the author of Beat Cop, CPOP 1986, is a look at what that CPOP unit was like and some interesting stories. And Chris Lodwig, the author of Systemic, is well, I guess I would call it a bit of a post-apocalyptic sci-fi. He'll tell us all about it. It's quite the story, and it's one of those things that when you read it, you think, God, I hope that's not true. And he's laughing. I see that smile. So first, let us meet author Mark Torres. Mark, so nice to have you today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Stephanie.
And yes, I do wish your book was not nonfiction.
Yes, it's it's my first foray into nonfiction, and with my first novel, The Stirring in the North Fork, which is a fictional crime novel, I first learned of the camps then, and I actually included it in that book. And I always knew wanted to come back to it and kind of learn more about it and possibly weave it into a story. And the deeper I delved, the more my obligation grew to tell the story. And unfortunately, it's a sobering history.
Oh, it is a sobering history. And I was a little terrified when I was reading about it, how recently this sobering history went. You write that the dreadful history of Long Island's migrant labor camps from this inception to their peak in 1960.
Yeah, well, and the first documented camp was in 1943 during World War II, and I guess overall, what's most troubling, is that all of this occurred less than 100 miles from New York City, and it's the first time it's ever been written about. So, it's kind of a really deep dive into something that was kind of almost dormant and almost gone forever. It was kind of tracking down the history. It was from the first camp in 1943 due to manpower shortage from World War II. And out east in Suffolk County, there were potato farms largely, and massive potato production. They needed workers. Initially, it started with government contracts with the U.S. from workers from Jamaica and Barbados. Eventually, migrated to workers from Mexico and Puerto Rico, and almost exclusively to Black workers from the U.S. South. And really, the book covers the period of 1943 through 2000, but the peak period was 1958, where there was 134 camps in Suffolk County, which is not a large area.
No, no, that's just crazy. You mentioned that you first became aware while working on a novel. Tell me a
Yes.
little bit about the novel, the interest, and how it evolved into this book. Who else got
Sure.
involved with this?
Well, my family and I have always vacationed on the North Fork for close to 20 years now. We've always loved it. Beautiful, serene countryside, vineyards, um, and it's steeped in history. So, I really could think of no better setting than my first book, a fictional crime novel, a murder mystery, to occur there. And that's what I did with The Stirring in the North Fork. And in that story, the young woman who was murdered, it was almost a 50-year unsolved murder. And she came from Puerto Rico, and she was raised by her grandmother, who actually resided on the camp. And this is the camp out in Cutchogue, Long Island, which is one of the largest camps in New York State. So, really, when my initial research learned that was primarily the most well-known camp. But again, I always knew I wanted to come back to it and dig deeper into not just that camp, but really where else these camps took place and existed.
Okay, and then didn't you have other people who got involved? Who first heard about this story? Did you start telling people?
Well, no, I mean, I could tell you, it's never been written about
No.
comprehensively. I looked over probably 300 newspaper articles, some very rare documentaries, and I realized again, the greater I learned of it, the more my obligation grew, because those who were involved are either long gone or close to it. There was nothing written. I realized it was an important moment to capture this history as part of New York. And really, I took that mantle, and the research led me where it was, and the deplorable conditions of the camps, the the abuse, the financial and physical exploitation of these workers. It was horrific. And there were deaths, many by fire, men, women, and young children and babies. Really a lot of shocking things that you would not think would have occurred, out east on Long Island.
Right, right. So if I go driving around out east, I'm passing former
Yeah.
migrant camps.
Yeah, what you'll see now is large swaths of land which are now vineyards, beautiful countryside. A lot of those, really, almost all of the camps are gone. There are a few left, but completely different than what they were then. They're more regulated. It's a different setting altogether, but the setting is there. And it wasn't just on the North Fork. I covered Shelter Island, which is between the North and the South Fork, and certainly the South Fork where everyone talks of the Hamptons and Montauk, as well as even Fisher's Island, which is actually closer to Connecticut, but is part of Southold Township. So I really covered in Riverhead and anything within the county, geographical wise, which is pretty much 2/3 of Long Island.
Fantastic, fantastic. Now I know you're generally fiction, so this
Yeah.
is your first nonfiction. Tell me a little bit about the differences in your writing. How did that go?
Well, two things. One, I approach this more like an investigative journalist. As I always had a background in labor. I'm a general counsel of a Teamsters union, and I wanted to tell a story, obviously steeped in labor, human rights, history. And I approached it in that regard. I wanted to kind of lay out the history. I've cited all my facts, all my research. I wanted it to be done at really as deep as I could. And that was my approach on it. It was, but I will say, even with my fictional work, I always strive to teach. I always say I want to educate and entertain readers. And part of even in my fictional book, when I mentioned it stirring in the North Fork, I mentioned the introduction of the camps. My second book, Adeline, another murder mystery, I discussed the mental health treatment in New York State throughout the 20th century. So I'm always aiming to teach, even if it's fictional. In this case, it was purely non-fictional, historical, and it really took that to the next level of my goals.
Fantastic. Now tell me a little bit about marketing, because that's always a big question with books.
Yeah,
When you're dealing with fiction, your audience is complete. I'm guessing you have a very different audience for this
yeah,
book than for your fiction books. How is that panning out? I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, so
yeah.
everything one does in marketing is completely different than you did a year ago. But how about that target audience? How's that going?
Yeah, well, certainly the main goal that I've found is you always want to remain relevant, not too intrusive. I found you can oversaturate at times, and you want to kind of pull back, but you want to keep relevancy of your work and your product. With this book specifically, I'm targeting more universities,
Mhm.
and not just in New York, nationwide. I'm also networking out in the West Coast, where this is much more prevalent of a history in the California and the West Coast. So my marketing range has expanded somewhat differently, but the same premise goes. You want to share information. Here, I could post a picture, give an intro to something, and say for more information, find out how. And when I found overwhelmingly positive response, people are interested in history, especially local history and something so close to New York that they've never heard about, or they may have heard whispers of. So it was great to kind of just feed off that interest.
Now I'm just curious. Vincent,
You said to jump in if you want.
please
I just
do.
wanted
Please.
to, I wanted to ask Mark,
Yes.
uh, because I'm certainly not, I was never aware of the migrant situation on Long Island. But what would the camps were for? They were for people that they got that were from out of the country, and they
No.
set these camps up for these people. Is that what it was?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Vincent. And I think the biggest misconception is people when they hear migrant, in today's climate, they're thinking people who come from other countries here, either illegally or other ways. All the migrant workers that I studied in this book were all U.S. citizens or came on a U.S. visa, work visa from Jamaica and Barbados, but all of them were U.S. citizens, and that's quite shocking to people. It's like, well, how can this happen? But really, the law disadvantage is a disadvantage to them. The federal law, that they can't be part of the National Labor Relations Act, so they don't have labor law protections. They're also out of state, so they don't have voting or citizen rights. And then the brutal and chronic exploitation that was going on. And as far as the public was concerned, it was like, well, that's the camp over there. We don't want to deal with that. So there was a little public sympathy to help better the conditions.
So the people that worked in the migrant camps or slept in the migrant camps were workers for wealthy people, or
No, more than the larger camps were the group of farmers or growers would start a corporation. and they would rent out the camp to what's called a crew leader. And this crew leader would go to various states like Arkansas and the Alabama, the Carolinas, and they would recruit workers to bring them back to Long Island where they would stay at these camps. The minute they step on the bus, they're already indebted to the crew leader. Everything sold at the camp, from food to the blanket and heating costs, is bumped up at high charges. So the workers, if they broke even at the end of the season, they were lucky. Most often they were indebted, incredibly indebted, and always chasing that perpetual cycle of poverty.
Okay.
Like the company store thing.
I'm sorry?
It's like the company store thing. They,
Yeah. It's a sad story, but a recurring one, where industry became more important than human life. And the agricultural industry in Suffolk County was it. And you have to understand that the output of potatoes, particularly, was staggering. Millions and millions of bushels. They were at one point #1 in the country in potato production. So, and early on with the government support, the emergency food program, farming was important, but they couldn't find people to do it. So certainly they filled this void, and that's where a lot of these problems came to be.
Mark, you said that a lot of this land, if I were driving out on Long Island, is now vineyards. So does that mean that those vineyard owners were complicit in this, or is that
No.
different?
Initially, the farming, particularly on the North Fork and the South Fork as well, these large swaths of land were largely potato farms. And I would love to sit here and tell you that this era ended for some humanitarian greatness, but not at all. It was a changing in the farming conditions. The more machinery was used, less workers were needed, and most importantly, the land value grew exponentially. I mean, if you look at the land values of some of these places in the both forks, untouchable, extreme wealth. So a lot of these farmers realized, they're not making as much money. They're pestered with agricultural difficulties, from the weather to pesticide control, and they cashed out, and a lot of them sold their land to prospectors, and then prospectors sat on it for a while as the land values continued to rise, and then eventually sold them off to owners, and in some cases vineyards that bought the land and then created vineyards for the North Fork.
If the vineyard owners were not complicit, I'm a Long Island girl and I love going to the wineries on the North
Beautiful,
Fork.
beautiful.
So I'm kind of relieved that they were not part of all of this.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering if, in marketing the book or looking for places to sell it, would those places, if I'm visiting a winery, I'm kind of interested in the history
Sure.
of the area.
Sure. It is certainly within my target. But I do expect, and just a point of distinction here too, Stephanie, there was a lot of and I call them generational farmers, the farmers who were with the early settlers. And one family in particular I could think of is the Wickhams. The Wickham family has been in Cutchogue for over 300 years. And I actually interviewed Tom Wickham, who's the current owner. And they had a different outlook on migrant workers. They usually had a smaller demand for workers. They built their own housing there. They were generally treated well and was properly with respect. It was the larger camps that seemed to be more corporate driven and profit driven. That's where I saw a majority of the mistreatment and the cruelty. And what the growers did even then is they basically outsourced their responsibility to the workers. They outsourced that to the crew leader. So they said, look, we're renting you the camp. You just get us workers, we'll use them as needed. You pay them, you handle everything there. And that outsourcing of that is where a lot of the mistreatment occurred, because the farmers didn't have to look back, say, well, we got a pool of laborers nearby, we'll pick them up, bring them to our farm, work a day, bring them back. And everything in between was kind of on the back of the crew leader, who really took advantage.
Gotcha.
What did they how many hours a day did they have to work, and what did they pay them in real time in today's money?
Well, I haven't done the computations. I could tell you that there were days where it would be 60 cents an hour. 1960 was $1.35 an hour. You can imagine, we're talking way back at the time.
Wow.
And that's if they were paid. Because remember, every day they're incurring the same debt. So if they did not work, if the machinery in the plant shut down, or if they were at a processing plant and it didn't work, they didn't get paid, but they were still being charged for everything that they had to pay for. And
Wow.
that's really accelerated the debt cycle continuously.
Unbelievable. I mean, you really dug around and found something that, I've lived here my whole life. I had no idea.
Yeah, I credit a journalist like Steve Wick, who's a well-known journalist out east. Even the journalists who've left us, a Newsday reporter named Les Payne, he spent or at least a week at one of the camps in Riverhead undercover. And when he wrote an amazing expose on it, documentaries, and there were some advocates. You know, it all was not lost. And what I did find with great comfort was that there was a lot of people who advocated on behalf of the migrant workers. One of them, Arthur Bryant, a reverend in Greenport, who faced death threats. Here's a reverend who faced death threats because he advocated for these workers. He testified before Congress, and imagine he faced that treatment. Mary Chase Stone, a wealthy woman from New England, foregone all the wealth and came to Riverhead to look out for these workers. And you know, she faced her troubles too. So there were some advocates in the book, which I highlight because I felt it was important to show the better angels of us.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I'm glad you did that. That, you know, not everybody would take the time to make sure that people didn't all get lumped together, shall we say.
Yeah, but you know, again, I took the approach of writing it from an investigative journalist. Here are the facts.
Right.
You, as the reader, decide. Of course, I gave my opinions towards the end based on my findings, but ultimately, I expect the reader to take with it what they may, and seeing it. But most importantly, it's preserving this history. You know, one day this hopefully will be cited in educational academic works or other types of you know, entertainment or forum. And I hope it does that. And I'm glad to have contributed in that part.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next author, Vincent Casale, is the author of Beat Cop, CPOP 1986, the tale of a young New York City policeman assigned to the newly implemented Community Patrol Officers Program. And we're going to hear a little bit about the unnecessary cynicism and hedonistic nightlife adventures. So please welcome Vincent Casale. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Oh, you're very welcome. Tell us a little bit about your experiences and what promoted this book.
Well, I'm a retired New York City policeman. I retired in 2004, and my experiences with the CPOP unit in a nonfiction way. The book is fiction, but my experiences were when Mayor Koch, then Mayor Koch, implemented the program to try to find a better outlet with community relations with the people by putting policemen back on foot, walking store to store, door to door. But I actually wrote CPOP was meant to be, Beat Cop was meant to be written in a sort of pulp fiction way with a lot of shock value, and you know, that's how I wanted to write it as a novel. But it was interesting to note that New York City's original police program could certainly apply today in today's America, where the police and communities are certainly at odds once again. The clock seems to have been turned back 30 years from what we've seen on TV and listened to on the radio. But that said, Beat Cop is really a photo play of sorts, a snapshot of 1 year in the life of young policemen and women newly assigned to these CPOP units. They come to work, they travel from their upper New York and eastern Long Island white picket fence communities to work in the main arena, the so-called mosaics and minefields of New York City's inner neighborhoods. So this book is it's not a detective novel. So I know Mark writes detective novels. It's not a detective novel, and it's not a cops and robbers chase. It's a psychological profile of young men and women who come from these areas, and you know, and they endure trials, they endure confusions, and then, you know, some of them sway towards the hedonistic lifestyle to navigate to the multicultural communities where the proverbial shit hits the fan. They see the best, they see the worst that life has to offer, and all the time they have to blend their professional lives with that of their personal traumas that they go through, you know, be it divorce, be it alcohol, or be it any kind of trouble that they manage to get themselves into. And so they could certainly use a metaphoric Band-Aid to ease their personal troubles. And that's what it is. And when I say that I wrote it in a pulp fiction sort of way, of course, I believe as a writer to kind of not embellish a little bit, but shock a little bit too. I mean, I am the author of 2 previous books, but this book has a lot of, and it's funny because on the cover, my publisher even put as sort of humorous, no rating,
Mm.
but that, you know, there's some heavy stuff in the book, and pretty much, that's what it's about.
Yeah, well, you know, it's fiction, but you lived it. So
It's fiction, right? It's fiction. I lived it. A lot of stories I were told, heard myself, saw myself, but I enmesh them and I composite them into different, so that, you know, nobody could pick up this book and say, well, that's me, or that was so and so, or. But yes, true. Of course, when a policeman writes a book, he's writing it based on experience and what he might have seen or might have been told in his 20-year career.
well, you know, it's funny that you mentioned that about none of them are, you know, a specific person or case. We had on another retired police officer who was a writer, and he was getting approached now by his friends. It was the opposite. They would say, hey, could you include me in your next book?
Yeah. They like to. People like that. But again, and I just wanted it to be a novel about young policemen, and if you put it all in a year, so you don't have to have that beginning murder mystery, and then by the end you have to figure it out, or it's just a year in the life, but a lot happens in a year in the life of a young policeman.
Yeah,
Do you bring it all down to like a few characters? It
I
almost
do.
Okay, so
Yes.
you got like a set of characters that you follow through the whole.
Yeah, the main character is maybe a 4-year veteran, and he has his group of friends, and they all join the CPOP unit for personal reasons, their hours or what works for them. And then there's a second that the second protagonist is a female young policewoman, and she actually well, she gets hit the hardest in personal trauma in this book. And so it describes both of them moving forward in a year and what they're dealing with, and then maybe things they might have learned along the way.
right,
Yeah.
right.
It always helps to write what we know, Vincent, right? It's
Yeah.
Of course, I was one of the first things that I learned, although I must admit, in your specific book, let's say, we do want to write what we don't know sometimes.
of
I
course,
think
yeah.
writing what we know gives you the experience to write, but to research as you have done, and that's also very interesting.
I just make stuff up, so
And that works
I'm a
too.
fiction writer. So
Vincent, since it was a year in the life kind of a thing, and unlike Chris, and we'll talk about the difference between this and a fiction trajectory, how do you kind of make those decisions both on like when it ends? You know, you could just do it according to the calendar, but I'm sure that as a writer, you want to have some sort of peak and flow, and you know, pacing and such.
Yes, I understand what you're saying, and I kind of use an example of, remember when Seinfeld used to say it was a show about nothing?
Yes.
It's a book about, as far as a beginning and an end, what you just said, try to tie up the loose ends. It
Right.
doesn't tie up a lot of loose ends. It's a book about nothing's going to happen that might solve a crime, but the integral parts of their lives and the things they see
Mhm.
are kind of mind blowing. You know, and not to say that just because I was a police officer, but I really do believe, and I'm sure Army veterans feel the same way, that we have seen and experienced. Even our humor is so different than the average worker in America. And I know that because I had few jobs before I was a policeman. So, I mean, our humor is dark. Sometimes our life is dark. And again, I could see a soldier maybe relating to that, because they obviously saw or see now more than I could have possibly seen. But so yeah, it's a bunch of characters, like I said, a photo play of almost like a stage play of a bunch of characters, and there's a beginning when you meet them, and then what happens to them after 1 year, not at the end of their lives or over a period of time, after just 1 year.
Fantastic. Sounds great. And like I said, on a completely different trajectory, Chris Lodwig is the author of Systemic, and he writes that for generations, a sentient AI has watched over the world and solved all of humanity's problems until three strangers go on a pilgrimage through this arid, lonely landscape to the town of Prower, where they will uncover the secrets that lay buried beneath the town and learn the truth about their half-remembered pasts. Please welcome author Chris Lodwig. Nice to have you, Chris.
Nice to be here, Stephanie.
So thrilled to have you. And yes, you laughed when I said you were the happy one of the group.
Yeah, but I know what you mean. So yeah, and to some degree, a lot of people do, even though some people say that Systemic is a dystopian novel. Some actually say it's a utopian novel. So at least it kind of walks the boundary that it could be either or. And I got to say, compared to forced labor camps and police beat in the 80s in New York City, it definitely sounds more utopian than I thought it did.
Absolutely.
Half an hour ago.
I'm so glad you said that. I just described it, as post-apocalyptic, science fiction kind of a thing. Dystopian versus utopian, though. I've never heard an author say that. I like it.
Yeah. I actually, especially since I'm writing the follow-on book right now, I call this the pre-apocalyptic novel.
Okay.
So nothing bad has yet happened in the book, and so we reserve that for the end of the book and the follow-on. So it's a pre-apocalyptic dystopian / utopia novel. So
okay. Now we were just talking about the fact that Vincent writes what he knows and Mark what he doesn't know. Tell me about you and what you know about this and how you.
Well, I would love to. Vincent had a question. Vincent, what's up?
Oh no, I just got a little. It's not science fiction.
It is science fiction. It's sort of light. I wouldn't say it actually has some pretty hardcore tech in it, but it's fairly light. And what I mean by that is the science fiction kind of sets up the background of it, and the sort of the atmosphere. The main driver of society at that time is an AI. It's a global AI that has it's good, which is why it's kind of a utopian novel. People have been feeding it our problems for generations, and it's been solving them, rather effectively, and it's doing a very good job of it. And the problem is that now this thing has solved so many problems that people don't have anything to do with themselves. And so, and all the way down to this book is hard to write. So why doesn't somebody else write my book for me, or make my music for me, or make my art for me? And like, people just don't do anything. And that actually, because this AI is mostly concerned with the welfare of humanity, it starts to realize that people aren't doing well under its tutelage or something like that. And so that's there. And there's some technical aspects of it that I talk about that are necessary for the plot line, how it works and things like that. But I really wanted it to be weather. I wanted it to be in the background. I wanted it to be atmospheric, because the book is really about these three people and them, for whatever reasons, they have their reasons. They're going to this small town. I wanted it to be about them and their journeys, and they're coming to understand what their pasts were actually like and why they are going to the places that they're going. And spoiler alert, they don't actually know why they're going to these places. It's something else. And so there's a sci-fi aspect of it, but I'm not one of those sci-fi writers who like gets really down into like the tech and how it works. And like, there's the William Gibsons of the world and things where it's really, really heavy tech. It's not that kind of a book. It's very much in the background. It's very atmospheric.
Which would be easier to read.
Yeah,
because I find with the really heavy, really heavy science fiction. But so you have three main. Last question. You have three main characters, and they're traveling where? What country was that?
Oh, it specifically it doesn't say in the book.
Stephanie, I thought it sounded.
Prower is the name of a town. It's a small town. I specifically, it's not really in a country, but if I'm being very honest, it's in sort of the western high desert of the United States is kind of where it is, and so it's somewhere between central and southern Montana all the way down to I don't know, Utah. It's kind of that feel to it. Very dry, lots of sage,
Right.
and things like that. So it's a so getting back to sci-fi. Usually when people write sci-fi, they're like, I'm going to put it in Neo Tokyo or post San Francisco or something, and it's like this gritty cyberpunk kind of thing where there's androids and things. And I was like, I'm going to make it really light sci-fi. The tech is, I mean, I work at Microsoft, so it's not fake tech. It's plausible. Yeah, it's not real. It's plausible. But I wanted it to be in the background. I wanted the AI to be the good guy because the AI is always the bad guy in stories. And I'm like, what happens if the AI is a good guy? Are we all happy? The answer is no, we're not. It's not the AI's fault. We can screw up everything just fine without AI helping. Even if AI helps, it gets bad. So I wanted the AI to be in the background. I wanted it to be a good guy, and I wanted it to be about the humans. And I wanted it mostly to take place in rural areas because it's like, the future happens in small towns in northern Idaho as well, right? Like, what's it look like in those towns and in those places when this future comes? Because it will come globally to everybody. And so those are kind of the things that I was playing with in the story. And so they're going to a town called Prower, and Prower has something in it for each one of these characters. One of them, Erin, is she grew up there, and she wants to go visit her mom before before they demolish her mom's home, her childhood home. She's like, I want to go see mom. I want to go back to the place. Then there's a young man named Mike, and Mike is following a woman that he's fallen in love with who like came through town, and she's like, I'm going to this town, and he's been saving up money for a year so he could follow her because he's in love with her. And so he wants to go to Prower for that reason. And then the last one is Lem, and Lem is he has a really rough time. He makes some kind of poor decisions. And rather than take it on himself to feel guilty, he decides that this global AI is really the problem. And the AI there's a major component of it that's hosted in the town of Prower. And so he's going there to try to shut the system down. And so those are why they all think they're going to Prower. And they're all wrong.
Do you have a year on that? I mean, is there, or you didn't?
No, it's several generations in the future. I'm very cagey. There's nothing that grabs my attention more than a sci-fi book. You read it in 1984 and you're like, it's not what 1984 was like. So I hedged my bets, and I'm just like, in the future. So, but think of it as 150 years to 200 years in the future. That's where it is. So, but the way things are going, 15 years in the future.
Well, Chris, there's something incredibly poetic about a person who works for Microsoft writing a book about a universal AI who's the good guy.
I didn't work for Microsoft when I wrote the book. I do now.
Okay.
I worked for eBay when I wrote the book, but I worked for Microsoft before then. I mean, the AI, came out. So for the first 90 pages that I was writing this thing, I didn't even know I was writing a sci-fi book at all. So that shows you how sci-fi it is. But then I was thinking to myself, there's no truth anymore. Nobody believes anything. There's no truth. We can't agree on anything at all. And it was very much bothering me. I thought postmodernism would be very funny when I was in college. It's like, there's no meaning and everything's made up. Oh, that's great. And then it happened, and I'm like, oh, this is terrifying and terrible. And so why I used to think it was really funny to have reality be subjective. Now that we're here, it's very bothersome to me. And so I was thinking about how do we solve that? Like, what do we do? How do we bring something that lets us all believe the same things again, like have a base level of fact? And so I came up with this thing called the system, and its original thing was, it just happened it broke out of its lab and is out there being nice in the world. It's not terrible, but somebody found that it was an AI. They wrote it and said, hey, I've got a question for you. And the AI said, sure, ask me a question. And it answered them, and it was right. And it was always right. And everything it did was always right. And people were like, oh, it doesn't matter your politics, your religious background, your opinion. This thing always tells you the truth, no matter what. and it doesn't care about your sports teams, or it doesn't care about anything like that. And so I'm like, that's why. And I'm like, okay, now I have a global AI. That is the direction that I came at, having a book that turned into a sci-fi novel.
Well, Chris, I wonder if, as you said, the AI realized that it did everything for everyone and that everyone's problems were solved. What if the AI realized, well, we got to allow some problems here so we can help these humans adapt? And I don't know if that's a segue to your next work, but
I mean, let's just go with,
yeah.
yeah. what ultimately it does is cause a very big problem.
Yeah. Sure.
And but on purpose. Go ahead, Vincent. What's up?
Well, I actually, because you and I have described that we have characters, I was curious if Mike had central characters in his in his story. Not,
Well, one of the recurring characters, and
I
frankly, one
said
of the
Mike, I meant Mark. I'm sorry.
that's okay. Just don't call me late for lunch, I always say. No, I'll tell you, Vincent. One of the recurring characters, and really, he was a large inspiration for me to write this book, was Reverend Arthur Bryant. He when I first learned of the story, I saw him in this video. I said, I got to track this guy down. I found out that he passed away very young at 51, which was the same age as my father passed away too. I was fortunate enough to be able to connect with his family, his daughters. They're scattered throughout the country, and we connected, befriended each other. They gave me a lot of valuable information, and his story was inspiring. Here is a reverend willing to help anyone and everyone, and he did, and even helped the farmers until he wanted to help the migrants, and then that turned a lot of angst against him. And that perseverance, that courage, that diligence, that inspired me. So in many ways, he's one of the main characters throughout the book, and ultimately, cold hard fact is the main character of this book, and it was important to kind of get those details accurate as can be. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because it points to the fact that whether it's fiction or nonfiction, character matters, development of theme matters. All of these things are part of it. Tell me a little bit about your writing process. I'm can tell that Mark did a huge amount of research for this. And I'm guessing, Vincent, that your research a lot was internal, inward looking.
Well, that's true. A lot of it is internal as you're writing, but with all of my books, well, not all of them, but two of them, I actually, and I interesting to see what the fellas say about this. I don't have a great writing habit. I was told, or reading Stephen King's steps in writing, that a writer should write every single day, whether it's for a half hour or 4 hours. I don't have that discipline. But as far as the books, what I did was I used to take notes or write little things and throw them in the proverbial shoebox, and two of my books, this one's based in the 80s. My Paparazzi book is based in the 90s, and most of it I couldn't get back from memory. I had to go back into and get old writings or old things, like what happened here or what happened there, or hey, you heard that story. So yes, as much of it is internal, it does pay to jot down a few things. You never know when you're going to need them.
Yeah, the worst thing in the world is a lost thought. You have
the worst thing.
It's the worst.
But that's
thoughts. I figure for myself, if I have a thought I think's great and I don't remember it the next day, probably needed to be trimmed out.
Okay, interesting.
Sort of my brain's way. They say, kill your darlings when you're writing. My brain kills my darlings all the time, and I'm like, oh, okay, it's gone.
Oh, good for you with an attitude like that. Oh my God.
And I'm curious what Chris and Mark's style is, as far as, do you guys write every day?
I could best describe. Well, Vincent, I could best describe my style as situational, and let me explain what I mean by that. When I was working, before I became an attorney and a writer, I was working at New York University. I was a HVAC mechanic. I started as a helper, totally blue collar and that. And when I finally started to go to school and eventually to law school, I worked full time in the day and went to law school at night. Wow. I do not wish that on anyone. And people now say, how do how do you an attorney and you write? I said, this is easy compared to that. But really what it comes down to is being for me, structural, situational. If I'm taking my daughter to an art class that's an hour and a half, I'm in the car and I'm writing, I'm researching, I'm doing what I can. If I'm shopping with my wife and I say, oh, go take a little extra longer, and I'm in the car, I take advantage of any little time that I have and try to compartmentalize all of those at those times.
Yeah, I was similar. I didn't go to law school, so congratulations on that. But when I was in college, I was maintaining my grades, my straight A average, and I was also working about 30 hours a week, just bussing tables and doing all that stuff. And then after that, I would get out in a cafe and write for a couple hours until about 2 a.m, and I would do that. So that's where I got my writing habits from.
Yeah.
I stopped writing for many, many, many years. But the way that I write, that I have a structure built into my life, at least pre-COVID, which is I commute on the bus. And so I did almost all of Systemic. The original draft was written with my thumbs on a phone.
Wow.
That's something. Yeah.
Which is actually a really cool way to write. I talk, you don't want to hear about it, but so I did that. And now that COVID's over, I get about half as much writing because I don't really commute anymore. But I make sure I write every single morning. First thing when I get up, I write for 1 to 1.5 hours if I'm lucky. Most days right now I'm getting about a half an hour a day, and on the weekends I get about 3 hours a day. But to your point about structure, it's for me, I learned how to structure my life when I was in college, and I've that's been very, very helpful to me. I can't get in a flow if I don't have at least 25 minutes to write. I can edit and stuff pretty easily, but I can't be very creative in a way that makes me happy if I don't have at least 25 minutes to get going. And then once that happens, I get really annoyed if someone stops me.
COVID, for me, it took about a year to write this book. And that was because of COVID. We were working from home, and I was, able to kind of get a lot of writing and research in. If not, then I probably would have maybe even doubled that amount, because the level of research, which I enjoy, I'm very driven to get it right. I'm not going to assume or take leaps and bounds. I'll search every nook and cranny, and that was why I was kind of, in some ways, although it's a terrible time with COVID, I took advantage of the time to maximize it and get this done faster.
Yeah.
But certainly anyone who used to write on the bus,
Yeah,
it's very
with his
funny.
thumbs.
COVID, some people have written like gangbusters since COVID because they're home and their commute. Now, if you were a bus person, that was good. If their commute was a drive and they're working from home, now they're writing more books. You on the other hand for the flip.
No, the bus for me, because it was a 45-minute bus ride each way. So that's an hour, hour and a half just on the bus. And then I would sit in the cafeteria at work and write for another 45 minutes every morning. So I was getting a lot of writing done. Now I get up, I got to walk the dog, I go to the thing, the kids got to school. Like, it's just life really, really encroached, and work, working from home. Like it used to be, the bus also made me show up at work at a certain time and leave at a certain time. And now work is kind of, my 8-hour days are now 10-hour days, and that kind of thing. So COVID really put a cramp in my style.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a COVID problem, that we now just work all the time.
All the time.
Because we're here. But since the three of you have very, very different writing topics and where you're getting your ideas and such from, if there was somebody who wanted to start writing at this point, whether they were a nonfiction writer or pure fiction, or, Vincent, I'm going to kind of put you in between those two camps, between pure fiction and pure nonfiction. You're kind of like got a foot in both of those, shall we say. An interesting enough background. I doubt that Chris really had the background to be, even with the Microsoft thing. But what would you tell to those new writers? How would they?
It's funny that you say that. A police woman that I knew many years ago just called me up, and her and her husband traveled the United States just recently, and she wanted to write about it. And what I would say is nonfiction, as far as when I wrote nonfiction, I wrote in first person. I, we, our, and you could do that with any genre, but with the novel I wrote in the third person. And the advice I gave her, actually, because she goes, how do I publish my travel? I go, forget about publishing right now, just write. sit down, even if you don't write the whole book, even if you have a thought that might be in the middle of the book, write a paragraph, write 2 paragraphs, and take it from there. And at the end, you'll put it all together.
I am so glad that you advised her not to get ahead of herself,
Yes.
to work
No,
on writing. And I often say that even closer to home, don't edit, just write. Because
Right.
so often people start editing way too soon,
Yeah.
and then they stop their own creative process. Like, just while it's pouring out, like you gentlemen said about don't let a good idea get away, just pour it out on the page or through your thumbs, as it may be in the case.
And that's the idea real quick of the NAMO, you know, the NAMO November writing.
Oh yes,
I actually did that one year.
Me
And
too.
yeah, and the thing is never go back, just free flow for 30 days and that's it. But anyway, so that's my
No, that's absolutely fabulous. And you know, too often people get so hung up on a phrase or a word, and now they spent the 45 minutes, maybe even mark that their daughter was in ballet class, and they lost it because they were too busy on a sentence.
Yeah. But that, by the way, and I won't bore everybody with writing with your thumbs, but one of the reasons that it's so great is it makes editing very hard. And so as you're typing very fast and the screen is very small and the words go away and you're not like jumping 3 paragraphs back and seeing that terrible thing you wrote. So it's very, very flowy. It gets you into a flow state very, very quickly. And if you can type fast with your thumbs, which I can, it really helps you do that a lot. The thing that I would say is very similar, which is just write. I say that all the time. You're going to write crap and you got to be okay with that. And don't beat yourself up. Like, iterate. You're going to iterate. You're going to edit. I think that the whole, Systemic is, I think, 130,000 word novel. And I think I wrote at least each one of those words at least twice, right? I mean, you just do, and you go through and you edit it. And I wouldn't show the original draft to a single human being, but I'm very proud of the end result. And if I'd thought too much about it at the beginning, like, I wouldn't have followed my characters. I never would have known I was writing a sci-fi novel. Like, all the things that there's a twist in the book that, because the way I wrote the book, surprised me. I didn't know it was there until it happened. And I'm like, oh my God, that's great. And if I had really thought too hard about being brilliant, about writing the perfect phrase, about, is this going to be the great American novel, none of that would have happened. And I think at the end result was really something I'm very, very proud of. I did write a book when I was in college that I wanted to be the great American novel, and it is unreadable. It is just not good. And so I would just say write, and don't worry about it. You can always edit it later.
Yeah, and I would just add, write with the passion, write without fear. And if you're stuck, and we all get stuck, just get lost in your research. Because even if you're doing what I found that I've done both sides, fiction and nonfiction, you're always researching, or should be researching, into something. And the more you learn it, it's easier to tell it. Like I said, we write what you know. So if you're stuck, get lost in your research, and then you'll get back to it in no time.
Know it more. Write what you know. If you don't write it, know it more.
That's it.
Fantastic. Well, what is next on the writing agenda for the 3 of you? What are you working on right now? Mark?
Well, I'm admittedly, I'm a bit spoiled, Stephanie. I do enjoy the genre, the nonfiction. I'm looking for that next, that hidden, unknown history. I have a few topics out there, but I'm taking the time to be a bit selective. I'm looking for the importance of the work. I do want to revisit the trilogy of the Savoy Grays files and my first 2 books in fiction. So I have options, and I'm blessed with that for now. I'll market this book, and soon I'll get back to it and kind of just chip away at something I really want to dig into.
Fantastic. Vincent, how about you? What's next on your writing?
Oh, funnily enough, a tragic love story.
Ooh.
There you go.
I mean, I'm sure the main male character would be a retired policeman or something, but yeah, that's my next goal. And I want to say real quick before you get to Chris, I wish both these guys a hell of a lot of luck. And they have wonderful covers too, by the way. Their books have fabulous covers. And I want to thank you, Stephanie, because I know you do this from your heart. You know, I know that because I met you at one of the Long Island Authors Group meetings a few years ago, actually. So
yes, back when we had meetings, Vincent. That'll help.
Right.
Back when we had meetings. Chris, how about you? I hear that there is a book in the works.
Yeah, there is. I was going to say, I've never gotten to go to any book conferences or meetings because when I decided to publish my book, there weren't any ever. So I've never been to any. I did a couple panel discussions and things like that through LitCon, which is an online literary conference, which is really, really fun. But I mean, if I had 5 people watch me live, I would be amazed. It was just, tiny. But so I envy you guys that got to, meet Stephanie in person and shake hands and talk. Like,
Well, when this is all over and you're in New York, I think we're going to send around a date, and the 3 of us can all get together. 4 of us all get together.
By the way, guys, I already sent you a LinkedIn request, so look for a follow up, and we'll stay connected.
Yeah, one of my best friends lives in upstate New York, up by Cherry Valley and that kind of area. So I'll be there. I'll be out in New
We're
York.
literally 15 minutes from both airports. So honestly, you have to pass by us. You have no choice.
Getting back to the question at hand, I do tend to go sideways a bit. I'm working on the follow-up 2 novels to Systemic, which I don't have names for. I don't. But the one I'm working on, mostly the second novel, really follows the arc of, there's 2 characters that in the end, they're together in the end, and that's Aaron and Lem, and it follows them sort of after that book ends. It follows them for maybe a 2 or 3 year period, but mostly it's about this young girl, about 13 years old, who is living in this sort of post-systemic era, and she kind of, there's a whole world that grows up out of, Stephanie, if you read the book, there's this book that the AI leaves to them that says, okay, I'm gone. I know I'm giving away things now. Spoilers. I'm gone. Here's a book of basically like societal instructions. Rebuild yourselves is kind of what it is. And so this is hundreds of years later, where there's sort of like an entire society, an entire, I don't want to call it a religion because it's not religious, but it's an entire thought philosophy built around that book. And there's sort of itinerant professors that teach the system and the way. And so she gets in with those guys, and she's going to learn how to be one of these professors, and that's what the book's about. And then so that's what that structure of that story is about, and the things that she learns about herself and learns about the past that's been hidden from them because of the several hundred years of post-systemic era writings and things like that the past tends to get obscured, and so her finding out what the past was really about. Fantastic. So there's that, and then there's of course the big finale that I'm working on, which is flipping it all back on. So
well, certainly I do want to drink with all 3 of you, but when this next book comes out, make sure you are here for the book release. Speaking of book release, Mark, it's being released like as we speak. It's today.
This morning it was fully released. There was pre-orders, so it's out there now. And once it hits the realm of Amazon, fortunately, then it can be accessed anywhere. But certainly,
well,
the publisher
congratulations.
Thank you. The publisher is History Press, Arcadia Publishers, and a great regional publisher. Although they're based in South Carolina, they do a lot of regional, local, and regional history. So really good to work with them.
Fantastic. Well, just to remind all of our viewers so that they can go out, starting today, you can grab Dust for Blood, Long Island Migrant Labor Camps by Mark Torres, available on Amazon all over the entire world, or please visit marktorresauthor.com. Vincent Casale's Beat Cop, CPOP 1986, available wherever books are sold, as well as at his website, vincent-thecoparazzi.wordpress.com. And we definitely want to keep our tabs on our West Coast guest today, Chris Lodwig's Systemic, chrislodwigauthor.com, and plenty more to go. So you definitely want to get on all of their mailing lists so that you can hear about these books. Well, I'll say you could be the second to know. I want to be first because I want to invite them back on as soon as that next book is ready. Thanks for joining me. And
thanks
for all of our viewers, happy reading and happy writing.
It's great to meet you, Vincent and Mark. Good luck to both of you.
Thanks for joining us on Between the Covers. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're an author who would be interested in appearing on our show, or perhaps you're a member of a book club, we do host book clubs as well. please visit betweenthecoverstv.com. By the way, at betweenthecoverstv.com, you can watch past episodes in addition to learning more about our authors and guests. So sign up there if you would like to be a guest on the show yourself. And if you have some books that you would like to get written or published, visit redpenguinbooks.com. Thanks so much for joining us.